Imagine a world where proving your innocence only sealed your guilt, where neighbors whispered your name in fear, and where the very act of defending yourself became the rope that pulled you toward the stake. This was not a nightmare invented for dark fairy tales, it was history. In the shadows of Europe, thousands of ordinary people were swallowed by the machinery of witch hunts, a storm that turned suspicion into death. And before we dive deeper, if you dare to uncover the truth behind this terrifying lie of the Middle Ages, hit that subscribe button now, because once you step into this story, there is no turning back. The myths are familiar: crooked old women burned at the stake, fanatical priests declaring guilt in God's name, demonic rituals under the moonlight. But the truth is far more complex and even more frightening. What if I told you that men, children, and even respected community leaders were also dragged into this frenzy? That in some places the church was not the hunter, but the voice of doubt, and that these events, far from being a relic of the Dark Ages, took place during the age of Da Vinci and Galileo, when Europe believed it was marching toward Enlightenment. To understand the witch hunts, we must step into a Europe trembling on the edge of chaos. Famine gnawed at villages as the Little Ice Age withered crops. Plagues swept through cities, leaving streets lined with corpses. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Christendom, pitting neighbor against neighbor. Amid this turmoil, suspicion became a survival instinct, and anyone different, unlucky, or simply disliked could be accused of carrying the devil's mark. Consider this chilling truth: roughly 1 in 4 accused witches were men. In Iceland, 90% of those executed were male. In parts of Switzerland and Russia, the balance tipped in the same direction. Yet the image of the witch as an old woman persists, because in most regions, women bore the brunt of persecution. Widows, the elderly women who lived alone, or simply those who were outspoken, society branded them dangerous because they strayed outside the expected roles of obedience and silence. The trials were not about catching sorcerers casting fireballs in the night. They were about reinforcing power and punishing defiance. A woman who owned property without a husband, a man envied for sudden prosperity, a family quarreling with their neighbors, all were vulnerable. It was less about magic and more about control. The accusation of witchcraft became the most efficient weapon in local disputes, the sharpest tool for cutting down those who dared to stand apart. And yet, contrary to the story we often hear, the Catholic Church was not always the villain lurking in the shadows. While preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of witches, some inquisitors, particularly in Spain, urged caution. By 1526, the Spanish Inquisition, ironically remembered as a symbol of cruelty, was warning against mass hysteria and demanding real evidence. Meanwhile, Protestant regions like Scotland and Germany erupted into some of the bloodiest hunts Europe would ever see. The real engines of persecution were often not priests, but local judges, secular councils, and mobs. Imagine a village council deciding the fate of your family, fueled by gossip and vengeance. Picture an angry mob storming your home because a cow stopped giving milk or a storm ruined the harvest. Witch hunts were grassroots terror, not decrees from distant cathedrals, and that made them even harder to escape. There is another myth that tempts us with romance: the idea that witches were wise healers, guardians of ancient knowledge, women persecuted for their herbal remedies. It is a compelling story, one that resonates with modern ideas of lost wisdom. But when we read the actual trial records, we see something different. Most victims were ordinary farmers, merchants, laborers, even clergy. They were not hunted for their secrets, but for their humanity, because they quarreled, because they stood out, or because misfortune needed a scapegoat. Take the tragic story of Katharina Kepler, mother of the astronomer Johannes Kepler. She was not a healer of plants, nor a whisperer of spells. She was a stubborn woman with a long-running dispute over an unpaid loan. When her neighbor's child fell ill, suspicion pointed to her. The quarrel became an accusation. The accusation became a trial, and suddenly, the mother of one of Europe's greatest scientists stood on the brink of execution. this was not the persecution of magic, but of ordinary tension twisted into mortal danger. The cruelest twist is that the witch hunts we imagine as medieval actually peaked in the Renaissance between 1450 and 1750. The very centuries of the printing press, the scientific revolution, and the voyages of discovery. As Europe dreamed of progress, it also lit thousands of pyres. New tools that spread knowledge also spread manuals for hunting witches. New governments that promised order turned suspicion into policy. It was not medieval darkness, but modern light casting even darker shadows. The medieval church once declared that belief in witches was itself heresy. For centuries, Europe officially dismissed witchcraft as superstition. But in the 15th century, that position crumbled. A new obsession with the devil's presence swept across pulpits and pamphlets fueled by fear and the hunger for authority. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum spread like wildfire, teaching judges and priests how to detect and condemn witches, creating an instruction book for terror. The irony is bitter. The same printing press that spread humanist philosophy also spread hysteria. A villager who could once only hear rumors at the market could now read entire treatises warning of witches poisoning wells, blighting fields, and seducing men into sin. Knowledge became a double-edged sword, sharpening both enlightenment and paranoia. At the heart of the accusations lay not sorcery, but suspicion. A farmer's cow stopped giving milk, surely the neighbor's curse. A storm destroyed crops, surely the widow by the woods. The smallest quarrel could grow into a fatal trial. Misfortune needed a name, and the label witch carried the weight of every fear people could not explain. Court records show again and again that trials focused less on spells and more on behavior. Was the accused quarrelsome? Did they skip church? Were they difficult neighbors? Social defiance was treated as a pact with the devil. The law turned ordinary conflict into cosmic battle, punishing those who simply refused to fit the mold of obedience. Consider the case of Agnes Waterhouse in England, 1566. The stories told about her spoke of a demonic cat, yet much of the testimony focused on her sharp tongue, her quarrels with neighbors, her refusal to submit quietly. In truth, it was her reputation, not her magic, that condemned her. The supernatural details were a mask placed over very human grievances. The hunts thrived in times of crisis. When frost destroyed harvests during the Little Ice Age, accusations rose. When plague swept towns, people sought witches to blame. When armies marched and governments faltered, local officials used witch trials to prove their authority. In Würzburg in the 1620s, famine, war, and fear created one of the largest witch hunts in history, with hundreds sent to the flames. Imagine the streets of Würzburg, then gaunt faces staring at empty fields, the smell of rotting grain soldiers marching through ruined villages. In such misery, people sought a culprit. The easiest answer was not poor weather or politics, it was witches. Even children were accused, their innocence smothered beneath the desperate need to believe someone was responsible. What is most terrifying is how systematic the process became. Torture chambers overflowed. Chains clinked in cold stone cells, the air thick with sweat and despair. Confessions poured out not because they were true, but because pain demanded them. Each confession pulled more names into the fire, each name another rope around another neck. The cycle was endless, self-fueling, and merciless. And yet not all authorities embraced the frenzy. In Spain, inquisitors often threw out cases demanding proof that no villager could provide. In Italy, skepticism sometimes prevailed, preventing mass burnings. These exceptions reveal a chilling truth. The hunts were not inevitable. They happened where fear ruled stronger than reason, where communities surrendered to hysteria instead of resisting it. The myth of religion alone driving the hunts is too simple. Yes, sermons thundered against witches, but the real causes ran deeper. Hunger, envy, greed, vengeance, and the fragility of community bonds. Witch hunts were less about theology than about the human need for control in a world collapsing into chaos. And that perhaps is the most frightening revelation of all. As the 16th and 17th centuries dragged on, the hunts spread like wildfire, leaping from one village to the next, each trial sparking another. Communities were hollowed out by suspicion. Friends who once shared bread now shared accusations. The sound of church bells no longer promised peace, but signaled another execution. Children grew up in the shadow of smoke, learning that misfortune had faces and names. They whispered warnings to one another. Do not cross the widow. Do not anger the magistrate. Do not let envy show in your eyes. Childhood itself became infected by fear, a lesson that even innocence could not protect you when the crowd cried, "Witch!" At the core of these tragedies lay a paradox. The more modern Europe became, the more ferocious the hunts grew. The printing press, the rise of nation-states, the growth of bureaucracies, each provided tools for order, but also sharpened the teeth of persecution. Progress became a double-edged sword, carving knowledge and terror from the same blade. The human stories buried in the records remain haunting. Families torn apart in a single week, fathers dragged to dungeons, while mothers and daughters faced questioning neighbors, forced to testify against one another. These were not the fantastical witches of legend, but flesh and blood people reduced to ash for the sake of social survival. Even animals were not spared from the madness. Cats were burned as devil's companions, their cries mingling with human screams. A dog wandering near an accused home could be killed as a familiar spirit. In the smoke of these fires, the line between reason and hysteria vanished completely. In places like Scotland, entire regions were swept into waves of accusation. Between 1560 and 1700, thousands faced charges often condemned by little more than rumor. Ministers thundered from pulpits urging communities to cleanse themselves of evil. The result was a cycle of accusation and death that left towns scarred for generations. But while local courts led the charge, these were not isolated pockets of madness. Networks of judges, preachers, and pamphleteers reinforced one another. A confession in one town inspired arrests in the next. Fear moved faster than armies, more destructive than plague, binding communities together in cruelty. What strikes modern historians is how ordinary most trials were. There were no dark Sabbaths, no orgies of devils, no flights on broomsticks. Instead, there were arguments about bread disputes over fences, jealousy of wealth, or resentment of poverty. Witchcraft was the mask placed over daily life, transforming petty quarrels into mortal crimes. The deeper tragedy is how effective the system became at maintaining order. People policed their own words, afraid to speak out of turn. Outsiders were quickly branded dangerous. Communities that might have fractured under famine or war instead turned their anger inward, binding themselves together through shared hatred of the condemned. Fear became glue, and executions became ritual. And yet, even within this nightmare, sparks of resistance glowed. Some judges refused to accept confessions wrung from torture. Some villagers defended the accused, risking their own safety to speak the truth. Their voices were often drowned out, but they remind us that even in an age of fire, there were still those who dared to stand against the flames. One of the cruelest aspects of the witch hunts was how confession bred more death. Under torture, the accused were asked to name accomplices. In desperation, they spoke any names that came to mind: neighbors, relatives, rivals. Each name pulled new victims into the fire. The machine fed itself endlessly, multiplying tragedy. Imagine the despair of a mother chained in a dungeon, whispering her daughter's name simply to end the agony. Imagine the daughter then being dragged before the same court, accused by her own blood. In this way, families destroyed themselves, forced by a system that turned survival into betrayal. The methods of interrogation were themselves weapons of terror. Bodies were stretched on racks until bones cracked, feet burned until flesh blistered, water poured until lungs nearly burst. Each scream was twisted into evidence, each groan another line in the record books. Justice became indistinguishable from cruelty. And yet the record shows something even more chilling. The accused often came to believe their own guilt. In a world where everyone swore witches existed, where neighbors testified with conviction, where torture wrung confessions from the soul, many went to the stake convinced they truly had brought misfortune. Fear reshaped reality itself. The hunts spread beyond Europe as well. In colonial America, Salem became infamous when hysteria claimed young girls, respected matrons, and even ministers. The Atlantic Ocean could not wash away Europe's nightmares. Instead, the flames leapt across continents, proving that fear knows no borders. But Europe remained the bloodiest stage. In Germany, Switzerland, and France, thousands burned. Some towns lost a tenth of their population. The economic impact was devastating: farms, abandoned families, shattered communities, hollowed out. The cost of fear was measured not only in lives but in generations of lost prosperity. Still, myths endured. People told tales of witches flying to secret Sabbaths, of devils dancing under the moon, of potions brewed in cauldrons. These were not real confessions, but fantasies spread by pamphlets and sermons. The reality, far more mundane and tragic, was that ordinary people died for ordinary reasons: envy, greed, and quarrels. What makes this history so terrifying is its familiarity. Even today, in times of crisis, communities look for scapegoats. Conspiracy theories spread rumors, ignite neighbors, accuse. The faces change, the accusations differ, but the mechanism remains the same: fear searching for a victim. Yet there is a faint thread of hope woven into the story. Some communities resisted. Some leaders refused to sanction trials. Some neighbors defended the accused. In these moments, we glimpse humanity refusing to surrender completely to fear, clinging to reason even as the crowd demanded fire. Eventually, skepticism grew strong enough to end the nightmare. Enlightenment thinkers questioned the logic of trials. Scientists demanded evidence. Governments realized that witch hunts drained more than they stabilized. Slowly, the fires died down, but the ashes remained reminders of how easily fear can consume reason. But the end was not sudden. In many regions, isolated executions continued long after intellectuals had denounced them. Villagers clung to their fears, unwilling to abandon the idea that misfortune could be blamed on human agents. Fear lingered like smoke in the rafters, long after the flames had burned out. By the 18th century, skepticism finally outpaced hysteria. Courts demanded evidence that could not be produced. Pamphlets shifted from fueling paranoia to mocking it. What once inspired terror began to appear ridiculous, a superstition unworthy of enlightened minds. Yet the memory of the hunts still haunted Europe, etched into its collective psyche. Historians estimate that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed as witches in Europe and its colonies. Behind those numbers are uncounted stories: families erased, villages depopulated, generations scarred. Each statistic hides the face of someone who once tilled the soil, sold bread, or cradled a child before being branded an enemy of God. The scars ran deep. In some regions, communities never recovered their former strength. Trust was broken beyond repair. The knowledge that a simple quarrel could turn fatal created generations of silence, where neighbors avoided intimacy for fear that closeness might one day breed accusation. The modern image of the witch cauldron, broomstick, cackling laugh is a faint echo of these horrors. Folklore softened the reality, transforming tragedy into Halloween costume. But beneath the mask lies the truth: witch hunts were not tales of magic, but of human cruelty dressed in superstition. The myths still shape us today. Many believe witch hunts were purely medieval, though they peaked during the Renaissance. Many believe the church was the main engine, though local courts often led. Many believe witches were healers, though most were ordinary people. These misunderstandings allow the real lessons to fade, replacing history with comforting illusions. But if we see the hunts for what they truly were, responses to famine, plague, war, and political instability, then the relevance to our own age becomes unavoidable. Whenever crisis strikes, humanity still reaches for scapegoats. Whenever uncertainty grows, whispers turn into accusations. The mechanism is timeless. In the digital world, witch hunts take new forms. Online mobs, conspiracy theories, and viral lies destroy reputations and lives. No stakes or flames are required. Fear travels faster now, burning people in the court of public opinion rather than the public square. The past is closer than we wish to admit. And so the story of Europe's witch hunts is not just a history lesson, it is a warning. Progress does not protect us from fear. Science does not shield us from suspicion. Technology does not silence hysteria. Each age invents its own flames. The real question is whether we will recognize the sparks before they consume us. There is hope, though, in the examples of resistance. Communities that refused to hunt inquisitors who demanded evidence, neighbors who defended the accused. They show us that hysteria is not destiny. Human beings can choose reason over fear, compassion over cruelty. Their courage whispers through the centuries, reminding us that even in the darkest times, light is possible. Picture the silence after the fires died. The stakes stood blackened, the ground beneath them charred and scarred. Villagers passed quickly by those places, whispering prayers, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. The smell of smoke clung to the air for weeks long after the last body had turned to ash. In these ashes, children grew up hearing warnings rather than lullabies. They learned that danger did not come from storms or beasts, but from the people who lived next door. The witch hunts rewired communities to expect betrayal, to assume that catastrophe must always have a human face behind it. Over time, skepticism grew stronger. Philosophers argued that belief in witches was irrational. Physicians claimed illness had natural causes. Courts quietly dismissed more cases. Yet, the memory of the hunts lingered in popular imagination, where fear still dressed itself in the mask of magic. The 18th century ushered in the Enlightenment, but the embers of suspicion smoldered. Even in an age of reason, the story of witches remained a tool for control, a warning whispered by parents to keep children obedient, a lesson taught by clergy about the dangers of sin. Fear adapted, refusing to die. When historians look back, they see not only the horror, but the patterns. Crisis breeds fear. Fear demands scapegoats. Scapegoats become victims, and the cycle feeds itself until it collapses under its own weight. The witch hunts are not an anomaly, but a blueprint, one that can reappear whenever uncertainty shakes a society. That is why this history matters now. We no longer light pyres in village squares, but we still light fires with words, with rumors, with accusations hurled across digital screens. A person's reputation can burn as quickly as a witch once did, and the mob still gathers eagerly to watch. The parallels are haunting. Just as the printing press spread manuals of fear today, the internet spreads conspiracy theories. Just as villagers once testified against neighbors today, strangers pile accusations online. The mechanism is the same: crisis, fear, accusation, destruction. And yet, just as then, resistance is possible. Communities that resist hysteria prove that human beings are capable of breaking the cycle. It requires courage, the kind of courage once shown by judges who refused false confessions by neighbors, who stood against mobs by thinkers who dared to ask for evidence. The witch hunts remind us that evil does not always come with horns and fire. More often it comes with ordinary faces, familiar voices, and shared fears. It is not the devil we must fear most, but the human tendency to surrender reason in exchange for the comfort of blaming someone else. So when we study the witch hunts, we are not looking at a dead chapter of history. We are looking into a mirror. The smoke that once curled above European villages still curls around us today, only in new forms. The question that remains is simple and terrifying. When the next crisis comes, will we learn from the past or repeat it? The story of the witch hunts does not end with the last trial or the final pyre. It lingers in the cultural memory of Europe, shaping folklore, literature, and even law. The silence that followed was heavy, as if entire communities agreed never to speak of what had happened. Yet the wound remained open beneath the surface. Generations later, children asked their elders why neighbors vanished, why certain names were never spoken, why the churchyard had unmarked graves. The answers were evasive, the stories incomplete. History became whispers, and whispers became legends. The truth was buried not only in ash, but in silence. That silence is its own kind of horror. A society that burns thousands of innocents but cannot bear to confront its guilt carries a scar that never fully heals. Each unspoken name is a ghost that still haunts each ruined life, a shadow that stretches across centuries. Modern readers are tempted to distance themselves. We tell ourselves we would not have believed such madness, we would not have joined the mob. But the witch hunts show us how easily fear rewires the mind, how quickly suspicion becomes certainty, and how readily people trade compassion for the illusion of control. The myth of the witch is now entertainment costume stories, Halloween decorations. But behind that myth lies the truth of mothers betrayed by children, neighbors turning on one another, judges twisting law into cruelty. To see only the myth is to forget the lesson, and forgetting is the first step toward repetition. For the witch hunts are not about witches at all. They are about us, our fear, our envy, our anger, and our willingness to destroy others to protect ourselves. That is why their relevance endures. They are less a story of the past than a warning for the future. Whenever crisis rises, whether famine, disease, war, or political turmoil, the temptation returns. The names change, the methods evolve, but the impulse is the same: to find someone to blame, to light the fires again, even if the flames are digital and the victims survive only in disgrace rather than in ash. And so the real terror of the witch hunts is not that they happened once, but that they can happen again. They reveal the fragility of reason, the weakness of communities, the ease with which justice can become a weapon. This is the shadow we still walk under, whether we acknowledge it or not. Yet hope remains. The same humanity that fueled the hunts also ended them. Voices of reason grew louder. Compassion refused to be silenced, and over time the fire died. If we remember their courage, those who doubted when all others believed, those who defended when all others accused, then we carry a shield against new flames. So let the lesson burn into memory. Progress does not protect us from fear, but awareness can. The witch hunts are not merely stories of the dead, they are mirrors for the living. And as you reflect on this dark history, ask yourself what modern witch hunts are we ignoring today. If this journey into the shadows has unsettled you, like this video, share it with others and subscribe so that together we can drag forgotten truths back into the light.